Hi, this week we're going to be talking about curriculum-based measurement and progress monitoring. You have a great reading for this week that provides you with a lot of specific details about CBM-PM, but I don't expect you to read the whole thing. Please read the first 4 chapters at least to prepare yourself for the information in this lecture, and keep the whole reading for your records as a valuable resource. I think you'll find curriculum-based measurement and progress monitoring to be something that you'll be doing as a teacher quite often. And this is also going to be a useful lecture because it will help you determine how to develop some informal assessments to follow up on the information that you got from your students' formal assessment that you should be completing at this point. So let's talk about what we're going to be doing during this particular lecture. First of all, we're going to be talking about what specifically is curriculum-based measurement and progress monitoring, and why do we want to use it? What's the rationale for CBM-PM? Then we're going to look at how to use this process as an assessment tool by creating probes, and probes are self-created tests that you might use to measure students' progress in particular areas or to get some baseline information about what a student is able to do. And you can use these probes again for monitoring progress, and we're going to talk about some ways that you can do that, and then some ways that you can actually create visual images about how the student is progressing. And this becomes particularly important for the last thing that we'll be talking about, which is how can you use curriculum-based measurement to help you in the development and monitoring of IEP objectives. So that's particularly important. So let's start with what specifically is curriculum-based measurement and progress monitoring. Well, CBM uses content from the curriculum to assess student progress within a given topic in the curriculum. So it's considered an informal assessment, and if you remember, we talked about a number of different informal assessment tools. And again, you're going to be doing a formal assessment using a standardized test on your student, and we're going to be talking about how to use that to target a specific area for an informal assessment later on in the course, in a couple of weeks in fact. But curriculum-based measurement is one of the tools that you can use to develop that informal assessment. So it's very important. And it helps us monitor student progress. So that's the PM part of CBM-PM, by comparing a student's progress with an expected rate of progress based on an achievement goal for the year. So if you're hearing the term achievement goal, you're probably thinking, well, that sounds like the kind of thing that we put on an IEP, and in fact it is. So what we're looking at when we monitor student progress is trying to create an estimated rate of improvement. How much do we want the student to improve over the year? So we know that if we're working with students with special needs, these are students that aren't making a year for a year improvement. In other words, if they're in second grade, they're not finishing up second grade with all the second grade skills and then ready for third grade skills. They're likely to be falling behind. So we have to identify an expected rate of improvement for those students, and the CBM will help you figure out how to do that. And then we want to look at, given that we've identified the rate of progress that we expect, we want to look at over time and frequently whether a student is making sufficient progress based on the achievement goals that we've set for an IEP. And if they're not making sufficient progress, we want to determine what to do about it. And CBM will help us do that. So let's briefly look at what the differences are between traditional assessments and CBM-PM. Well, we talked a lot about traditional assessments, so by this point, you know that we do use them, and they tend to be quite lengthy. Lengthy being that it can take an hour or more to give a student a traditional assessment in the primary curriculum areas, which are usually reading, math, and writing skills. They're lengthy, and despite the fact that they're lengthy, they don't necessarily contain a sufficient amount of content to help us really identify the problems that a student may be having in any given area. Another thing about them is that they're not administered on a regular basis. That is, we can only use our traditional formal kinds of assessments, our standardized tools like the Woodcock-Johnson or the KTEA. We can only use those once a year. And so that's not really often enough to help us see whether a student is making sufficient progress during the course of the year. We may find out at the end of the year that they haven't made any progress at all, and that's not the right time to find that out. Because we can only administer them once, possibly twice if there are alternative forms of the test, we don't receive as teachers immediate feedback about the student. So again, we're not seeing the kind of progress they're making, so we don't have the information that helps us determine whether we should be changing our approach to intervention or not. And student scores tend to be based on national scores and averages, which you now know because we talked a lot about norm referenced assessment and the normative group. Well, that doesn't help me if I'm working in Pacoima. I want to know what the students in my school are likely to be able to do on average. I want to have some norms that are relevant to me, in other words. And if you look at that reading that you have this week, you'll find in that, embedded in that, ways of determining both your own class's norms as well as norms for your school. And that's a very useful tool, I think, that you might find as a way to think about what kind of progress your students should be making. Certainly looking at your school's norm and your own classroom norms would be a really significant way to do that. So I urge you to look at that part of the reading that you have to identify how to do that. We won't be talking about that here, but remember that one of the problems with traditional assessments is that we're comparing our students to national averages, and I'm not sure that that looks like the kinds of students that we work with every day. So what about curriculum-based measurement? Well, CBM has a strong evidence base, so it's widely used, and there's a great deal of evidence that suggests that it's a good tool for monitoring progress and for measuring students' achievement on an ongoing basis. It's an easy and quick method to gather information about student progress, specific usually to the goals that we're working on with students. It enables us to look at student scores and frequently look at them, and then be able to adjust our programs and our goals according to the kind of progress that students are making. So for example, if you have a goal that a student by the end of the year will be able to read 70 words per minute of a grade level text, and you get a few months or even a few weeks into your instructional program and you see that they're falling behind that goal, you can adjust either the goal, in other words, make it a little bit easier, perhaps targeting 60 words per minute, or you can certainly adjust your instructional program to try to find different sorts of tools to help the student make progress. And curriculum-based measurement is going to help you do that on a frequent basis. And then again, as I talked about, rather than national norms, you can compare your students' data to your own classroom, your school's data, or even school district data, rather than those national norms. And so what does CBM look like? Well, some of the basics of curriculum-based measurement are that we use it to monitor student progress throughout the year. And I want to add the word frequently in there because we can implement curriculum-based measures often as once or even twice a week, certainly bi-weekly and monthly, using the probes that you would develop that allow you to do that. So at regular intervals, you can measure student progress. And certainly you can use those measurements, because they're frequent, to graph student data and get a visual representation of what students are doing. And that's useful for you, but it's also useful for your students because students are energized by seeing a graph of their progress, particularly when that graph is showing that their progress is gradually moving upwards, rather than being discouraged by feeling like they're just not doing as well as they should be doing, but not having specific data to support that. And you can use student data to quantify your short and long-term goals that will help you meet the end of your year goals. So you can actually use the data that you're collecting to help you develop realistic benchmarks for the year. They're brief and easy to administer. They don't take a lot of time. So rather than that hour or hour and a half or even 2 hours that it might take to administer a standardized test, a curriculum-based measurement is often administered in as short a time as 10 minutes. So there you can see that you can do it pretty frequently. And they're very easy to administer. They don't require all of the things that are needed for that you've learned about for really doing a good standardized assessment. You can do it in groups, in your own classroom. You can take a child aside and give them a worksheet to complete on their own. It's not something that is really drawing attention to them. And they're the kind of thing that students are used to, too. Students are used to seeing tests on a weekly basis, like a spelling test or a reading test or a math test. So they don't create the same levels of anxiety that a standardized test might create. All of the measures that you might develop would be different, but they assess the same skills at the same difficulty level. So, for example, while on one probe that you create, you might have single-digit addition kinds of problems. Well, on one probe, it might be 2 plus 5. On another probe, it might be 5 plus 3. They'll be different, but they're the same level. And then they're graphed. And again, I can't overemphasize that. Those graphs are very visual representations of what a student is doing. And that helps you make instructional decisions because you know, oh, I need to change because we're not making enough progress. Or you know, wow, this is really working and look what's happening for this student. The student is really learning. And the student gets to see that as well. So here's a hypothetical fourth grade curriculum. And as you can see in math, there are a variety of things that a student is expected to do, having to do with multiplication and division primarily, but also adding on to what they already know about addition and subtraction, working with fractions and whole numbers and mixed numbers. So here are the kinds of things that we would expect a student to accomplish by the end of the year. And I want you to take a look at this and pause this lecture for a while and create a probe that contains those specific objectives for a whole school year, a worksheet with 25 problems that represent the math curriculum that you've just seen. So 25 problems, that would be a probe with 25 problems per page, and in those 25 problems, each of the skills that are contained in this hypothetical fourth grade math curriculum would be measured. So for example, one problem might be 25 plus 38. That would be a multi-digit addition problem with regrouping. And so you might have one or two of those kinds of problems in your 25 problems. Likewise, you might have a multi-digit subtraction problem that required regrouping, and you might have 2 or 3 of those. Multiplication facts with factors to 9 might be 2 times 8, might be 9 times 7, and so forth. So you have 3 or 4 of those, 2 or 3 of those. Each one of these would be represented in your one-page probe that would have 25 problems on it. So that's your challenge. Pause the lecture and create a worksheet with 25 problems representing that math curriculum with 25 problems per page. Okay, go ahead. So I'm going to show you some examples of worksheets that were created to measure that math curriculum. And notice that there are several things happening in this worksheet. First of all, there are 25 problems, and they represent at least one problem represents one of the objectives for the fourth grade curriculum. There are random numerals within random problems. So you can see in the colored circles, for example, you have a division problem next to a multiple digits addition problem. So they're randomly placed on the page. And there's a variety of different numbers obviously used. So here's one example of a probe that might be created. And here's a second example of a similar kind of probe. Now you notice that these are different problems if you look at the first probe versus the second probe, but they represent the same objectives. So in each worksheet of 25 problems, all those objectives from that fourth grade math curriculum are represented on one page. And now in creating these, we can use these for a variety of reasons. And we'll move on with that in a second. I did want to take a second, however, to point out that when you're working with students that have disabilities, you might target 25 problems as being the number of problems that you might want on your probe that represents the curriculum. But 25 problems on a page might be too much for your students, and you might then want to make it a little bit simpler, perhaps 10 problems on a page, so you'd have 3 pages of math problems to equal those 25. Whatever kinds of adjustments you have to make to meet the needs of your students, and you can see that they're clearly separated by boxes. The first one, the boxes are a little less distinct than the second one. One might be easier for students with some kinds of disabilities than the other. But you can make the probe work for you, and you have a recording sheet built in because the student is going to do their work right there. So you have something that you'll have as a measure. Now these probes can be given frequently, and again you'll have a number of different ones that you can use frequently throughout the year. And you would start with the probe at the beginning of the year to see what baseline skills the student had. I would want to let the students know that this is the fourth grade curriculum, so you're not expected to know everything that's on it, but let's see if you know a few of the things. So you get a baseline of what they're able to do, and then from there you're targeting their completion of all of the items on that curriculum. So does your probe look like this? Here's an example of how a probe like that might be graphed by the teacher. So let me flip back to that for a moment. If you see of these 25 problems on the page, I actually completed it myself. I guess I know fourth grade curriculum. And there were a total of 60 digits on the probes, approximately 60 digits that you could get correct if you answered all the problems. And if you look at this graph, the graph has a possibility of as many as 70 digits correct. And we're starting out with a student that, looking at this graph in October, was able to get approximately 5 or 6 digits correct on that whole sheet. And then we're looking at the gradual first of all, not much progress, but then over time, increasing amounts of digits correct that the student is able to achieve on these kinds of probes. So we see quite graphically that the student is moving towards success. And if all of our probes have about the 60 digits as the ultimate success that you can achieve, our goal line would be up here. And we can see that the student is making progress towards that goal, but I'm not sure at this point, because we haven't calculated rate of progress yet, I'm not sure at this point if they're going to achieve their goal, but you can see this is a graphic representation of that. So I've used the term now digits correct. I want you to get an understanding of what I mean by that. So this is a common way of looking at success in math on these curriculum-based kinds of measures. A correct digit is the right numeral in the right place. So here you see 3 different examples. You've got the first example with 4 correct digits. In other words, the student got the entire problem correct and all 4 digits are correct. 2, 3, 6, and 1 are correct. In the second problem, the student made an error, and we can see what kind of an error the student made. Actually, they forgot to account for the fact that they had borrowed from the 5 to get the 6 over here, so they got, their answer was 2461. Thus, 3 digits are correct, the 2, the 6, and the 1. And on the third problem, the student made an error and was only able to get 2 correct digits. The 2 and the 1 are correct, but the 2 in the middle are incorrect. So this is how we calculate the number of correct digits for any given problem. And what we look for in a curriculum-based measurement, and this is why we graph it, we're looking for increasing scores. Increasing scores indicate that the student is mastering the 4th grade curriculum, and flat scores, or even decreasing scores, which I hope never happens, indicates that the student is not profiting from instruction and requires a change in the instructional program. So again, this graphic representation of that, which is really rather important. So here you see an example of Sarah's progress on the number of digits correct across the school year. And starting out in September, she was able to get approximately 30 out of the potentially 70 or more digits correct that you could get on these probes. And over time, you see Sarah's making really nice progress. There's nothing here that would really flag it for me. There's occasional dips where I might want to take a little closer look, like right here in the middle of October. There's a little bit of a dip. But in general, she is making steady progress towards being able to master the 4th grade curriculum by the end of the school year. That's a great graph, and Sarah would be, I think, pretty proud of that graph, and we would have points along the way where there are dips that we could talk about it and address particular problems that Sarah might be having. On the other hand, here's Jessica. Jessica is exhibiting flat progress across the school year. She started out at approximately 25 digits correct on the probes, and over time, as we gave the probes, we see that Jessica is not making really any kind of progress towards our target, which would be up here, around 70 plus digits correct on the probes. This is a clear indication that we need to adjust the curriculum. And I would say, if I had a student whose end of the year graph looked like this, I would say I haven't done my job as a teacher, because right around here in October, I should have been asking, what can I do to help Jessica? And I don't know if that occurred or not, but if it didn't occur, that would be a problem. We should expect that we could be able to chart intervention happening, hopefully maybe sometime around here, and with good intervention that we would begin to see a gradual increase, but we're not seeing any increase over the school year. So whatever is happening, it's not working, or Jessica is really struggling, or both. But again, a graphic representation. Later on, next week actually, when we talk about response to intervention, you're going to see how looking at a graph like this and having decision-making points along the way, let's say every 6 to 8 weeks, for example, having decision points along the way can really help us make decisions about changes in a student's instructional program, as well as increasing interventions for a student that will help them, or hopefully result in an increase in progress rather than this flat kind of line. But for now, let's just talk about how we can graph these things. So that was math. Now we're going to move on to looking at constructing curriculum-based measures for reading. Now in reading, in curriculum-based measurement, we often talk about, or primarily target, fluency. So the creation of fluency probes, and you're going to see this on your worksheets that you'll be doing later on, as well as in the reading that you have. We look at giving the student grade level or appropriate instructional level reading passages if we're talking about students with special needs. So instructional level reading passages that are used as our fluency probes, and the students are asked to read those passages orally for 1 minute while the teacher records the errors. So with fluency, we're talking about timing it, and the timing is usually a minute of reading, oral reading time. And what we're looking for is the number of words that the student can read correctly per minute. And if you're taking the reading classes or you've taken one of those, you're probably pretty familiar with this. Looking at the words correct per minute, WCPM. And then we're looking at the accuracy, which is the percentage of words presented that were read correctly. And then developing a rubric for prosody, but we're not going to be really talking about that so much as we'll be looking at the graphs for the number of words read correct per minute. And then in comprehension, CBM often uses maze technique as the primary method for measuring comprehension. It's a simple way to check comprehension, but I don't think it's necessarily the most valid way. And if you remember from how we talked about validity, we talked about appropriateness, completeness, and the method for response. Well, in your worksheets for this week, you will see some other ways to check on comprehension, but we're going to stick with the maze procedure for now because it's a little easier to graph. So fluency primarily being the target, and then with comprehension being able to select the correct word to fill in the word that's missing from a given passage. Now here we have a visual of recommended weekly growth for reading in words at each particular grade level. So these represent recommended growth rates that are kind of general, standard, if you will, expectations. So in first grade, we expect students to be able to improve in words read per minute by 2 per week. In second grade, we expect that to be about approximately 1.5 words per week. In third grade, we expect that to be approximately 1 word per week growth, and so forth, as you can see on the chart. Those are realistic expectations for each grade level. And then those have been adjusted for special education. So you see if a student is struggling with reading, a realistic expectation for them might not be 2 in first grade, it might be 0.83 and so forth as a weekly expectation. In general education, on average 1.8, so realistically we're aiming for 2, but 1.8 would be sufficient, and and 3 would be ambitious. So this is one way to use a chart like this. Now schools may have their own expectations, but curriculum-based measurement does require us to have general expectations for growth in various areas of development for students that we can target because we want to measure a given student progress against that realistic or expected growth rate. And if you look at the reading for this week and they talk about how to measure your own school's norms or your own classroom norms, getting at what is the growth rate that can be expected, is one way to begin to develop your own norms and then comparing any given student against those expectations. So this is just a general kind of chart. You would have to adjust it for your own setting or your own individual students. And there are a variety of ways to do that. So how do we determine progress? And let's just target fluency. To determine baseline, what we do is have the student read 3 passages orally, and use the median score as the baseline. So they read 3 passages orally, and we get the number of words correct per minute on each of those 3 passages, and we chart those. And we take the median score, the average score, as the baseline. That is where the student is beginning. And then we establish a goal. And the goal would be based on either back to the expectations chart. Our goal might be on the realistic growth rate for the student's grade level. It might be a special education goal, it might be an ambitious goal, depending upon the student. And so we establish a goal and we plot an aim line. So the aim line is going to go from that median score, which is the student's baseline, to the ultimate goal, which is what do we expect the students to have achieved by the end of the school term. So we use that table to determine what's reasonable and multiply the weekly growth expected by the number of weeks of instruction that are left. So here's an example for a second grade student. Their baseline was 55 words correct per minute. The weekly expectation based on, we'll flip back, based on second grade level, the realistic growth expectation is 1.5 words per minute. So you see that here. So we take the number of weeks left in the school year times 1.5, and we expect that the student will have grown by 38 words per minute by the end of the instructional period, the 25 weeks. We take their baseline of 38, or we take their baseline of 55, and we add that 38 to it. So our target goal is 93 words per minute by the end of the 25-week period. So you see we're increasing from 55 to 93, and we would draw a goal line from that 55 to 93. And now each week we can give probes. It's the same kind of probes, reading 3 passages orally or reading a passage orally. Get a score for the student and plot that on our graph. And then we're looking or comparing the student's rate of growth, whatever that might be, to that line of projected growth if everything is working well. We'll plot data 1 or 2 times per week. So I don't think it would be an unreasonable or unusual expectation to have a student sit down and orally read a passage for about 1 minute. And so you can see these are quick probes that we're giving in curriculum-based measurement. And we plot that on the graph. And if we see that the student is falling below the aim line on 3 or 4 consecutive measures, we can adjust our instruction. And we can also plot a trend line for the student, which is providing the average performance of the student. And that to do that, we divide the data points. So each time that we give the probe to the student represents a data point. And we divide our data points into thirds. And we find the median points for the first and third groups. And then we plot and connect those points on the graph. That's a little hard to explain in words, but we'll see some visual representations of that in a moment. And you'll also see some representations of that in this week's worksheets. So let's move on to comprehension. I promise we will get to see some visual representations of those graphs, so don't worry about it. Determining progress in comprehension, and remember we're using the fill-in-the-blank method, close method, maze method, whatever you want to call it. So we want to select grade or instructional level passages and keep the first sentence of the passage intact, and then delete, blank out every nth word, leave a blank in its space. So you can determine which words to blank out. You obviously want to blank out a word that can be filled in by using the context of the sentence and the passage, because that is what is the comprehension aspect of it. So you're going to delete every nth word, whatever you determine to be an appropriate number, and whatever is appropriate based on the curriculum and the expectations of students, and leave a blank in its place. You're going to supply 3 words for the blank that the student can choose from. So we're not asking them to retrieve a word from their memory, which could be a problem. We're asking them to identify the word from 3 given words that is the best word to fill in the blank. And only one of those words should really make sense. So we're not trying to trick the students or make it particularly difficult. We're trying to measure whether the student can use the context of their reading to determine the words that fill in the blank. And so when you are choosing the 3 words to use as your measure, the words that you use, except for the correct word, should not make contextual sense. They should not rhyme with the correct choice. They should not sound or look like the correct choice. They should not be nonsense words. They should not require the student to read ahead to eliminate a choice. And they should not be challenging in terms of meaning. So can you visualize this? You have an instructional level passage for the student to read. The first sentence is intact because that's usually the topic sentence and gives us, the student, a clue about what it's going to be about. For the remaining sentences, you're going to blank out a word or a certain number of words in the remaining sentences. And for each blank, the student has 3 words to choose from that they can use to fill in the blank. And one will make sense and the other 2 will not. And again, we'll graph that. And you're going to see some examples of how we do that. And it would certainly be the number of words correct that the student used to fill in the blank based on our expectations. So now in terms of spelling, I want to think about constructing probes that measure grade or instructional level words. So in grades 1 through 3, or instructional levels 1 through 3, we expect a student to be able to spell approximately 12 words. And in grades 4 through 8, we expect a student to be able to spell approximately 18 words, usually per week is what we're talking about. And how we score spelling is a little bit different from what you might expect. Students get 1 point for each 2 letters that are in correct sequence. And they get 1 point for the correct beginning and ending letters. So for example, the word is time. T gets 1 point. TI gets 1 point. So that's 2 letters that are in the correct sequence. IM, again, 2 letters in the correct sequence, gets 1 point. ME, 2 letters in the correct sequence, gets 1 point. And E, the ending letter, gets 1 point. So that is 5 correct sequences for that one word. And we plot the number of correct letter sequences and the number of correctly spelled words for the student. So let's say in first grade, given that the student should be able to spell 12 words in a weekly spelling test, we would calculate the number of correct sequences in those common first grade words, and we would count the student's correct letter sequences and the number of correctly spelled words. And that's what we would plot on our graph. And again, you'll see some examples of this. Here's the expected weekly growth for spelling in letter sequences. So remember, approximately 12 words, but we're expecting, in terms of realistic growth, that students would grow in the number of correct letter sequences by 1 per week. If they're in second grade, 1.5 would be ambitious. 0.65 for third grade, 1 would be ambitious, and so forth. Again, these are recommended growth rates, and you would adjust them for your individual students or schools. But the point is that you have a realistic growth rate, what you expect students to exhibit in terms of an increase over time, so that you can calculate using some of the calculations that we talked about previously. You can calculate a target, and you can plot the expected rate of you can plot their actual rate of growth and compare it to the expected rate of growth over time to help make instructional decisions. Determining progress in math and curriculum-based measurement, what we're going to do is create probes, and you've already had an opportunity to do that in math. Create probes that are measuring grade or instructional level computational problems. Generally, probes are consisting of approximately 25 problems. You can make adjustments depending on what you know about your students and what your expectations are in terms of the curriculum. In a 25 problem probe, students typically would be given 2 minutes to complete the problem, so it's partly fluency and partly accuracy that we're looking at. And we score the number of digits correct per minute. And we've already seen what that means. 1 point for each digit correct in the answer. And here's another example just to remind you. 54 plus 21. The student answered 75. Therefore, 2 digits are correct. And we plot the number of digits correct per minute. Okay? That's what would be on our graph. Here's an example of recommended weekly growth for math in digits. So for grade 1, you can see 0.3 digits correct. Ambitious would be 0.5. So basically what we're expecting is the students will get more and more accurate over several weeks in first grade, second grade, third grade, and then as they progress, the expectations go up a little bit. And you can see what ambitious expectations are over in this column. So again, these are just recommended rates of growth, and you would make changes based on your own school or classroom data or individual student data that you have. Just to summarize what the research is before we move on to how to use curriculum-based measurement in IEPs, which is kind of important. Let's just talk a little bit about the research so that you know that you've been exposed now to a evidence-based procedure that helps us monitor progress in student achievement in reading, spelling, and math. That's what we've looked at so far. What we know about curriculum-based measurement is that it's been found to really affect academic achievement when the results are used to modify instructional planning. Now that's really important, that whole statement. It's useful when it's used to modify instructional planning. So if you remember the chart that we looked at earlier when we were looking at Jessica's progress, which was relatively flat over time, that use of curriculum-based measure is graphic, but it's not useful in terms of really affecting academic achievement because nothing was changed over the course of the year. Jessica's progress remained relatively flat. So we know that curriculum-based measurement is only effective in terms of making changes in academic achievement that are positive when we use it to modify instructional planning, when we make decisions along the way that we need to change to help the student. And Jessica's graph represented no change. So either nothing was modified or it wasn't effective for Jessica. But if in October someone had seen that Jessica wasn't making good progress and used that as evidence that there was need for a change in instruction, and then continued to monitor to see if that change was working, we would know that by the evidence out there on curriculum-based measurement, that would be an effective tool. What we know is that when teachers use it, they tend to set higher goals for their students because you can see right away that the goal that you've set is either too high or too low. 1 or 2 months into the instructional year, you can already see whether you're going to meet or surpass your goal. And at that point, you can make adjustments. And we don't just adjust our instruction when students aren't doing well. We can adjust our goals when students are doing well and set higher goals based on realistic student achievement all along the way. The graphs allow students to see more feedback about what they're doing, and I think in terms of a motivational strategy, being able to see your progress moving, even if it's small movement, towards a realistic end of the year goal is extremely motivating for students. They are motivated when they see that kind of feedback. And likewise, when they see themselves dipping down, it's a good point at which one can talk with a student about what do we need to change to put this back on the growth rate again. And I think when we're talking about students that have special needs, especially, it's useful for both students and teachers to see even small amounts of progress, because sometimes we get bogged down in not seeing the great leaps that we might see with typically developing students. But the little steps are rewarding for both students and for teachers. Teachers tend to modify instructional techniques more often when they're using curriculum-based measures, because again, they can graphically see whether the student is making progress or not, and it comes back to the teacher. If the student is not making progress, the teacher needs to change. They need to modify something about what it is that they're doing. It's a useful pre-referral strategy. So let's talk about that a little. When a student is being referred for special education or potentially special education services, the first question that's asked is, what kind of data do you have that suggests that this student needs these kinds of services? Well, these curriculum-based progress measurements, these graphs, are useful and compelling data that shows students' actual performance. And if you can indicate along the way, well, here's where I changed instruction, and you can see that with this change I got a little bit more progress, but the student is continuing to fall behind, then you again have more evidence about the student's need for assistance. So it's a really good strategy for a gen ed teacher to use prior to making a referral to special education. It helps to predict future performance on high-stakes tests, those high-stakes tests being the standardized tests that we use for all students, like the Common Core assessments, or high-stakes tests include standardized tests that we use at the end of the year for the students' IEPs, or for eligibility kinds of purposes. The progress on the graph is predictive, so it has this validity. We would call it criterion-based validity for predicting potential future performance. If you're making steady progress, we can predict that you'll do better on these high-stake tests. It's a valid assessment for determining eligibility for special education, so we can use curriculum-based measures even without standardized measures as a way of measuring student achievement and showing that a student is falling behind their peers and thus might be eligible for special education. Teachers and students tend to like it better. We're talking about a few minutes out of instructional time to administer a curriculum-based probe. It looks like what you're doing in school. It's not a high anxiety test or situation. And if it's used routinely, everybody gets in the flow of using it. Curriculum-based measure is more user-friendly than standardized tests. It certainly shows us whether the student's acquiring skills or not. It's valid for showing progress for students who are bilingual, because we're measuring their progress against their own baseline. We're not measuring, so to begin with, that's what we're looking for. And if we use curriculum-based measurement correctly, we're setting realistic benchmarks and long-term goals for the students based on their baseline and their expected rate of progress. So it's adaptable to all kinds of students, not just students who are bilingual, but it certainly works for them as well because it's within the context of their classroom routines. But it certainly is not useful for more theoretical kinds of constructs. So we can't use it really to look at conceptual understanding, for example. We can look at specifics of measurable performance, like computation is a measurable performance, but being able to deconstruct a word problem and conceptualize what needs to be done is a little harder to create a curriculum-based measurement for. It can be done, but these sort of important higher-level thinking skills are a little harder to get at because we don't have clear targets and benchmarks for things like that. So let's move now to how does curriculum-based measurement help us in the development of IEPs. The first thing I want to show you is that there is the National Center on Student Progress Monitoring, which is a website that you can access. At the end of this, you'll see the links to this National Center, and you'll find a number of different articles there about how to use curriculum-based measures, how to use it in individualized educational programs, and so forth. So this is a great resource for you. So what we've already learned about curriculum-based measurement, it's certainly valid as an assessment system because it is appropriate. It's linked to what you are doing in your classroom and what the specific curriculum goals are for your students. It's linked to the curriculum. So that certainly improves its validity. And the kinds of measures look like the things that students are asked to do on a regular basis in school. So that really affects its validity as well. In terms of its reliability, using probes that measure the same skill even though it uses different types of problems, so different math problems, for example, but the same kind of math problem on each probe improves the reliability of the test. And again, it's related back to the validity of the test. So if these are things that are likely to be good measures or accurate measures of what the students are able to do because they're familiar to the students. And if you can add two-digit numbers with regrouping on one probe, you're likely to be able to do it on another, so there's repeatability there. And it looks at basic academic skill areas. Reading can be used for writing, although we didn't talk in depth about that, but you'll see that in your reading how to do that. Certainly spelling, because those are simple skills to measure, and mathematics, primarily computation in mathematics. So the basic academic skills are what we use curriculum-based measurement for. In terms of IEPs, curriculum-based measurements help us determine what a student's present level of performance is. So we've already talked about trying to get at a baseline of what students can do and some of the ways of doing that, and I'm going to elaborate on that as we go along. We've talked about how to, we haven't really talked about annual goals, except to say that curriculum-based measures helps us determine what our target might be for the end of the year. So that certainly gives us a way of beginning to formulate an annual goal for the student. And then it helps us in terms of another component of IEP, which is a measurable objective for progress. So we're going to look at how we turn curriculum-based measurement into a mechanism for addressing these three important components of an IEP: present level of performance, annual goals, and measurable objectives for progress. So present levels of performance. We take the initial curriculum-based measurement scores and translate those into present levels of performance. So if you remember back to a student being able to accurately compute 35 digits correct on a math probe with 25 problems, that's a basic present level of performance. We're measuring in the beginning what a student can do. And then we can compare their performance on frequent probes as we move on during the year, and we can target a goal based on school or district expectations or curriculum expectations, whatever we choose to use, even classroom expectations that are unique to your particular group of students. We can target a goal, and we can look at student performance compared to the line towards that goal from their baseline. We use consistent measures. So these repeated probes that we use tend to be measuring the same thing in the same way, but using slightly different examples for the student to complete. Our scoring procedures are consistent, and so we looked at a curriculum-based scoring procedure that had to do with digits correct or words correct per minute. And the difficulty level is consistent throughout. So that also affects our reliability. And the team can transform the students' initial scores on the curriculum-based measures into IEP statements and also into IEP goals. So here's some examples of how present levels of performance begin to be developed into goals, starting with what the student is able to do at the baseline. So in reading, we have JR, and given randomly selected passages at the 3rd grade level, JR currently reads aloud 65 words correct per minute. That's his baseline. That's his present level of performance. And in mathematics, given 25 problems representing the 3rd grade level, JR currently writes 20 correct digits in 3 minutes. So we have, again, a measure of what JR is actually able to do on this probe when we're talking about his present levels of performance. So in terms of annual goals, we think about what do we want the student to achieve by the end of the year. And I think that this is probably the hardest part of developing an IEP, is identifying realistic end of the year goals for our students. And the problem in special education is that we don't have an exact curriculum guide that helps us pinpoint what our end of the year goals might be. So for example, if you're in general education and you're teaching 2nd graders, you have a 2nd grade curriculum that guides you through the year, and at the end of the year there are a certain number of skills that you expect the students to have mastered that enables them to move on to what will be in the 3rd grade curriculum. Those curriculums have built-in goals, and you know what a student should be achieving by the end of the year. How many new spelling words should a student learn in 2nd grade, for example? It's built into the curriculum, and those weekly spelling tests are built into the curriculum. But for students who are in special education, who are not achieving year for a year kind of progress, and I think it's probably true in gen ed too, students don't always achieve year for a year progress. We need other kinds of metrics that enable us to determine what is appropriate. So for example, if you have a 2nd grader who has a learning disability in reading, should they achieve half of the 2nd grade's goals in a year's worth of intervention? Should they achieve a quarter of a 2nd grade curriculum goals? 3/4? What are we targeting? What are we aiming for? It's very difficult because each student in special education is different. So curriculum-based measures help us determine what skills should be mastered by the end of the year based on realistic expectations of student performance, factoring in what expected progress should be. So if you remember back to the tables, we saw that while a 1st grader might be expected to read 2 more words per minute per week, a student who was in special education might only be expected to master 0.8 words extra per minute per week, so that we can identify a lower target goal for that student based on realistic expectations that can be set. And again, in your reading, you'll see some ways of doing that. But another way of doing that is to look at students' progress over shorter periods of time and create a rate of progress that's realistic for an individual student as well. So those graphs that we're talking about can become very important for not only giving us a baseline, but helping us determine what an appropriate end of the year goal might be, and then helping us measure student progress against that. But pay particular attention in your reading to how to develop classroom-based or school-wide or even district-wide kinds of goals that are realistic, because that really helps with this second part of goals or probes that represent skills to be mastered by the end of the year. And then based on that, we can develop realistic goal statements that reflect our expectations for the students. Here's an example of what an annual goal line might look like. So I said we'd talk about graphs a little bit more, and so here's an example. If you see in the beginning, in the first 3 weeks of instruction, we had 3 data points that were measuring the students' words read correctly per minute. So the student, somewhere around 40 to 43, maybe to 45 words per minute in the first 3 weeks, gave us our baseline data. And we draw a goal line from the median, the middle data point, and then project it out to our realistic end of the year goal. And in this particular case, it's approximately 70 words per minute, or end of the instructional period goal. So at the end of 14 weeks, here's our line of expectation. We are expecting that the student will go from approximately 40 to 43 words per minute, and by the end of the 14-week instructional period, they should be reading 70 words per minute. X is our end of the year performance goal. So that translates then into a measurable objective for progress. We take to get to our annual goal, which if you remember back to this graph, was approximately 70 words per minute. So we have an annual goal of, in that case, a number of words per minute. We subtract the current performance from that, and we divide it by the number of weeks between the baseline and the goal, and we get our measurable objectives for progress. And I'll show you an example. Here we have present levels of performance. And remember JR, given randomly selected passages at the 3rd grade level, JR currently reads aloud 65 words correct per minute. So here's our annual goal. Given randomly selected passages at the 3rd grade level, JR will read aloud 115 words correct per minute by the end of the year, or in 35 weeks, to be more accurate. So our measurable objective for progress, our benchmark, given randomly selected passages at the 3rd grade level, JR will read aloud 1.4 additional words correct per minute each week. So we have our 115 words, which is our target, minus 65, which is what he's currently able to do, divided by 35, which is the number of weeks we have for instruction, and that gives us our target of 1.4 additional words correct each week. So that gives us our benchmark. We know what our expected rate of progress is. We know what our annual target is, and you can see how this nicely fits into an IEP. So now here's a challenge, and take on this challenge if you would like to receive a bonus point for this week. And create a graph on which you can track student progress towards that annual goal that we identified. So create a graph that would measure student JR's progress over a 35-week period towards this annual goal. Given randomly selected passages at the third grade level, JR will read aloud 115 words correct per minute by the end of the year, or in 35 weeks. That's our annual goal. So, challenge, create a graph to track progress towards that annual goal that we identified. And I would expect your graph to have a target line for tracking, and of course we don't have individual weekly data points, but your graph should reflect an opportunity to plot those data points, looking like we've already seen some examples of graphs. So if you create this graph and you upload it onto Moodle, and I've created a place for you to upload those graphs, you will get a bonus point for this week. Here's an example of goals and objectives in math. Given a present level of performance, 25 problems representing the third grade level, JR currently writes 20 correct digits in 3 minutes. So here's our annual goal. Given 25 problems representing the third grade level, JR will write 40 correct digits in 3 minutes by the end of the year, or in 35 weeks. Our measurable objective for progress: given 25 problems representing the third grade level, JR will write 0.6 additional correct digits in 3 minutes each week, and that is 40, which is the target, minus 20, which is what he currently can do, divided by 35, which is our number of weeks, and that gives us the 0.57 rounded up to 0.6. And again, for an extra point, you can create a graph to measure student progress on that annual goal for JR in math. So this week, you can get 2 extra points if you create and upload 2 graphs for graphing JR's progress. So we use the weekly data points to compare the trend line against the goal line. If the trend line is steeper than the goal line, you raise the goal. If the trend line is below the goal line, you modify instruction. If the trend line is at the goal line, the student is making sufficient progress. So here we see an example of words correct per minute. We see the student's trend line here. We see the student's goal line plotted from the median of the first 3 weeks to the target at the end. And in this particular case, we can see that the student is making progress better than expected. So whatever we're doing is working. Now in this particular case, we see the student's trend line here, the solid line. And we see the goal line, which is the dotted line, and we see that the student is not making progress towards the goal line, and in fact falling increasingly behind the goal line. And so in this particular case, this is an example of a student where we should be saying right around here, right around week 6, we should be saying it's time to modify instruction. And again, when we look at RTI next week, you'll see how to use this data, because curriculum-based instruction and measurement falls nicely into an RTI kind of model. You'll see how to use data like this to make decisions about when to change instruction, and also to monitor whether those instructional changes are successful or not. But here's the basic visual of how to do that. So if you want more information about student progress monitoring, here's the National Center on Student Progress Monitoring website. You'll find lots of stuff there. Here's some examples of what is there. They'll talk about what it is. There are newsletters. There's a whole library. There's a number of tools. So the nice thing about this is, with curriculum-based measurement, even if you Google it, you will see that there are tons of ready-made curriculum-based measures out there. So while you as a teacher can make your own to reflect your curriculum and your expectations, you can also get a lot of help in how to do that. Even you'll find sites that will give you a template for creating your own tools. You'll see sites that will have specific curriculum objectives, specific examples of curriculum probes, and so forth. So curriculum-based measurement is a really useful tool, and this particular website will get you started in that. Shows you what's in the web library, lots of research on curriculum-based measurement if this is something that you're interested in, links to other resources and so forth. You'll find it, again, a useful tool. And then in particular, you may find these progress monitoring tools to be particularly helpful. And just to finish up, I want to remind you that you have not only to do a formal assessment, which is that you'll be using a standardized test to test a student, and you've all identified what tests that you're going to use out of the 4 that we've identified to use for this class. But then you're going to, and in 2 weeks we're going to be talking about how to do this, you're going to look at the students' responses and select an area that you will single out to create an informal assessment to probe further into the student's skills and abilities in that particular area. And these curriculum-based tools are very useful examples of what an informal assessment might look like. And if you'll remember the probes that we saw throughout this lecture, they're very simple. They're 1 page. They're 3 short passages. They're easy to create, and you have then already your protocols, your visual representation of what the student was able to do. If you're doing a reading kind of probe, you have a sheet on which you can record student errors. So you're creating your own test, but that's a much more specific and focused kind of measure when we're talking about looking at a given curriculum. And you'll see in the worksheets that we have for this week some examples of real specific target probes that are not looking at a curriculum for a whole year, for example, but might be looking at a specific skill that a student might need to acquire. And that should give you some further ideas about some informal measures that you might develop on your own. And we're going to spend the rest of the semester talking about informal measures and talking about ways to analyze the results of these to make instructional decisions for students. So I hope you enjoyed this, and really save that curriculum-based measure reading that I gave you. It's an excellent resource, and I look forward to seeing your answers to this week's topical activity.